October 12, 1987, in the lower field of her Harlan County farm, Eleanor Vance traced a finger along the rusted gear of a textile loom. The mill had abandoned 1400, and Harlan Briggs, the co-op manager, had just laughed. "That iron's worth less than the gas to haul it, Ellie." But Eleanor saw what he didn't. For 3 years, she'd studied every bolt in the county library's engineering manuals. Eleanor Vance stood there long after Harlan Briggs' pickup truck had kicked up dust on the county road. Her finger, still tracing the gear's tooth, felt the grit of rust under her nail. She wiped it on her denim jacket, the faded blue fabric catching the October sun. The lower field of her 320 acres stretched around her, the corn stubble golden in the late afternoon light. This farm had been in her family since her great-grandfather broke the prairie sod, and it ran modest but stable in 1987. She and her father Robert made enough to keep the mortgage paid and the tractor running, nothing more, nothing less. Not rich by any stretch, but they weren't staring down the barrel of a foreclosure notice like some folks in the next county over. The farmhouse sat 50 yards uphill, its white paint peeling at the eaves, with Robert's workshop, a converted granary, visible through the oak trees. He'd been a machinist for 32 years at the John Deere plant before retiring, his hands still stained with oil even in sleep. Eleanor adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, the light freckles across her nose warming in the sun, and tucked her small leather-bound notebook deeper into her jacket pocket. How did 1,400 tons of rusted textile looms end up in the middle of her corn country? Let me tell you about the Hawthorne Mill, because you need to understand what happened in 1984 before you can understand why Harlan Briggs was wrong today. The Hawthorne Mill had hummed in Harlan County for 40 years, weaving cotton for work shirts and bed sheets. Its brick walls stood just beyond her eastern fence line, smokestacks piercing the horizon like broken fingers. But in 1984, the owners packed up and left overnight, abandoning the entire operation when cheaper labor opened overseas. The lease agreement, a thick document Eleanor found while sorting through tax records in her father's filing cabinet, had one crucial clause buried on page 17. It said that any equipment left on the property after 90 days of abandonment reverted to the landowner. Eleanor counted the days on a scrap of paper, her auburn hair falling across her eyes as she leaned over the kitchen table. 91. She became the owner of 1,400 Hawthorne iron looms Model T14, each weighing 2 tons. That was 2,800 tons of iron nobody wanted. Most people see a rusted loom and they see scrap iron. Robert Vance saw a machine that had woven cloth for 40 years and still had life in it. But Robert was a retired machinist, his silver-gray hair pulled back in a low bun, his brass pocket watch ticking softly in his corduroy trousers. He knew iron could outlive generations if treated right. He also knew sentiment wouldn't pay the property taxes. So when Eleanor showed him the lease clause, he'd studied it under the kitchen lamp, his gray eyes narrowing at the fine print. He said only, "You best be sure," before pocketing the watch and heading to bed. Eleanor took the lease clause to the county recorder's office the next morning. The clerk, Walter Pritchard, a man who'd known her since she was in pigtails, stamped it with a red seal. It was official. She owned the looms, but what were they worth? She drove to the Harlan County Library that Tuesday in June of 1984, her scuffed brown work boots crunching on the gravel path. The library was a brick building with tall windows, smelling of old paper and lemon oil. She asked the librarian for engineering manuals, her voice quieter than she intended. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, led her to the reference section. There, Eleanor found a dusty volume titled Textile Machinery, Principles and Practice, published in 1952 by Singer Manufacturing. She opened it to the index and ran her finger down the page until she found Hawthorne Iron Looms, Model T14. The entry said they were built to last, with cast iron frames and precision gears, and that they were becoming rare collector's items in European textile museums. That was the first spark. For the next 3 years, Eleanor became a regular at the library. She learned about metallurgy, about how cast iron's carbon content gave it resilience against stress fractures. She studied the tensile strength of the gears, the refractory lining of the old boiler room, the way timber moved in loom frames during seasonal shifts. She filled her small leather-bound notebook with sketches of gear assemblies and calculations for load paths. She never told a soul what she was doing, not even her father. She knew that if word got out, someone might try to buy the looms cheap, or worse, the county might reassess her property taxes based on perceived value. So she kept it quiet, studying in the quiet corners of the library while the looms sat rusting in her lower field. Mrs. Gable started saving engineering manuals for her, pulling them from the discard pile with a wink. For Ellie's hobby, she'd tell the other librarians, and Alina would nod, pretending it was just a passing interest. But her hands never stopped turning pages, her eyes never stopped tracing diagrams. She learned why Hawthorne used chilled cast iron for the gears. It created a harder surface that resisted wear while maintaining flexibility. She memorized casting tolerances down to the thousandth of an inch. Every bolt, every shaft, every bearing race became familiar as the lines on her own palm. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at something everyone else had written off and saw what it could become? Maybe it was a cracked engine block at a salvage yard, or a pile of chipped mason jars behind a bottling plant. Whatever it was, you felt that little tug in your chest, that whisper saying there's more here than meets the eye. That's the feeling Alina Vance lived with every day for 3 years. She tucked it away, but it never went silent. It hummed beneath her chores, her crop rotations, her conversations about corn prices at the feed store. It was the reason she'd stayed on the farm when others her age fled to cities, the reason she'd spent evenings with engineering texts instead of at the VFW hall. Then came October 12, 1987. Harlan Briggs, the co-op manager, drove his pickup out to the farm. He was a man who knew the price of everything in Hardin County, and he'd come to talk about next year's seed order. But when he saw the looms, he stopped dead. He got out of his truck, his navy blue work shirt and red plaid vest standing out against the rusted iron. He kicked one of the looms with his polished brown brogue, the sound ringing like a cracked bell. "That iron's worth less than the gas to haul it, Ellie," he said, and then he laughed. The silence lasted about 2 seconds, then he started laughing. It wasn't cruel, it was the sound of a man who'd seen 19 years behind the parts counter, who knew scrap value like he knew his own heartbeat. He saw rust, not history. He saw weight, not engineering. He climbed back in his truck and drove away, leaving Alina standing in the field, her yellow cotton t-shirt damp at the collar. That night, Alina sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd eaten every meal since she was a girl. Her father Robert was already in bed, the house quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. She pulled out her leather-bound notebook, the pages filled with years of research. She traced the sketch of a Hawthorne gear assembly, the lines crisp and precise. And for the first time in 3 years, doubt crept in. What if Harlan was right? What if she had been chasing a dream, wasting years on something that was truly worthless? The numbers in her notebook suddenly looked like scribbles, meaningless marks on paper. She closed the book, the leather cover cool under her palm. She laid her head on the table, the wood grain rough against her forehead. The thought of giving up, of letting the looms be hauled away as scrap, made her stomach twist. But what if she was wrong? The wind rattled the window panes, carrying the scent of dry earth from the fields. She thought of Robert's quiet skepticism, the way he'd never dismissed her but never encouraged her either. She thought of Harlan's laugh, honest and weary. Sleep wouldn't come. She rose before dawn, the house still dark, and walked to the granary workshop. In the dim light, she ran her hand over Robert's old bench vise, its $8 paid at a farm auction 20 years ago. She picked up a rusted gear fragment from the loom, turning it in her palm. The metal felt solid, true, but was it enough? By 9 o'clock that morning, Alina was walking through the doors of the Hardin County Library. Mrs. Gable was behind the desk, her silver hair still pulled back in that tight bun. Alina asked for the engineering section, specifically manuals on textile loom mechanics. Mrs. Gable nodded and led her to a card catalog. Alina flipped through the cards until she found one for a book titled Advanced Loom Mechanics, a Singer engineering manual published in 1952. It wasn't in their collection, but Mrs. Gable said they could get it through interlibrary loan. Alina filled out the request form, her handwriting neat and precise. She would wait as long as it took. 2 days later, the book arrived. Alina sat at a table by the window, the autumn sun streaming in. She opened the cover of the 1952 Singer Engineering Manual, the pages crisp and yellowed with age. Her finger traced the first diagram, a detailed cross-section of a Hawthorne iron loom gear assembly. And there it was, the confirmation she needed. The caption read, Hawthorne Model T14, precision cast iron gears, designed for museum preservation due to historical significance and engineering excellence. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The numbers in her head clicked into place, the gear ratios, the tensile strength, the historical value. It was all there, she wasn't crazy. The looms weren't scrap, they were something else entirely. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The corn was harvested, the bills were paid, and the looms stood silent in the field. That didn't last. Opened the 1952 Singer engineering manual wider, the spine cracking softly under her hands. The corn was harvested, the bills were paid, and the looms stood silent in the field. That didn't last. Alina opened the 1952 Singer engineering manual wider, the spine cracking softly under her hands. How does someone go from standing in a cornfield, staring at rusted scrap, to knowing exactly which library journal to request? Let me tell you about cast iron metallurgy, because you need to understand why rust isn't the end of the story before you can understand why Alina Vance's wire-rim glasses were smudged with dust at 9:30 on a Tuesday night in the Hardin County Library. Most people see a cracked engine block, and they see landfill. Her father Robert saw the grain structure in the fracture line. Alina pulled 3 more volumes from the Industrial Journal's shelf, their spines stiff with disuse. The air smelled of paper and neglect. She carried them to the oak table where the lamplight pooled yellow against the green felt, her faded blue denim jacket brushing the chair back. Her leather-bound notebook lay open, pages filled with tight script and sketches of gear assemblies. She flipped to a dog-eared section on refractory linings, her thumbnail chipped from prying open rusted loom housings earlier that day. The Singer manual showed stress points on textile machinery frames, but it was the 1948 issue of Modern Foundry that held the key. She needed the tensile strength specs for Hawthorne's proprietary iron blend. The library's copy was missing. She'd already sent 2 interlibrary loan requests, the slips tucked in her notebook like receipts. Waiting felt like watching corn grow. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The dust settled on the reference desk. That didn't last. The librarian cleared her throat, nodding at the overdue stamp on Alina's card. Alina signed the new request forms without looking up, her mind still in the foundry. She knew the iron had to withstand constant vibration while maintaining precise alignment. If the frame warped even a 1/16 of an inch, the shuttle would jam. Hawthorne had solved it with a manganese additive nobody else used in the 1930s. She'd read it somewhere, maybe her father's old machinist handbook, the one with the coffee stain on page 73. She'd found it at a farm sale for $1, its pages brittle as corn husks. Robert had taught her to read metal fatigue like weather patterns. Look for the story in the cracks, he'd say, his brass pocket watch ticking against the workbench. Now she traced a line in the Singer manual. Cast iron's brittleness is offset by its damping capacity, ideal for high-vibration applications where steel would fatigue. Her pen scratched the calculation. 2 tons per loom. 1,400 looms. But weight wasn't the point. It was the grain. Let me tell you about interlibrary loans, because you need to understand patience before you can understand how Alina found what everyone else missed. The request for the 1948 Modern Foundry Journal took 17 days. 17 days of hauling rusted loom parts to the granary, of scrubbing cast iron with vinegar and steel wool until her knuckles bled. 17 days of Harlan Briggs' laugh echoing in her head whenever she mentioned the looms. She'd seen his navy blue work shirt and red plaid vest leaning against the feed store counter last week, gold fountain pen clipped tight to his vest pocket. Scrap iron, Ellie," he'd said, that single dimple flashing as he shook his head. "You're wasting good daylight." Now she sat in the library's hush, waiting for proof. The journal arrived wrapped in brown paper, its cover stained with what looked like machine oil. She tore it open, fingers trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the smell of old ink and the weight of possibility. There it was, Hawthorne Iron Works Model T14 exclusive manganese steel composite frame. Withdrew from U.S. market 1951 after European mill modernizations. Her breath caught. Below it, a footnote, now sought by textile museums for restoration projects. She read it twice, then a third time. Her pen circled the words European textile museums. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a stuck shuttle. Most people see a pile of rusted machinery and they see worthlessness. Robert Vance saw the engineering discipline behind every casting. Aliner's wire-rimmed glasses slid down her nose as she leaned closer. The article detailed how European mills had replaced T14s with newer models in the 1950s, scrapping thousands. But museums were buying them back. One line jumped out. Hawthorne T14 restoration project at Musée des Tissus, Lyon, acquired 3 units at auction for $850 each, 1984. $850 per loom. She did the math in her head, 1,400 looms. Her pen flew across the notebook, minus restoration costs, minus time. But first, could she restore them? She flipped to the metallurgy section, her finger tracing the manganese content specs. Hawthorne's iron resisted corrosion better than standard castings. The rust was surface deep. She remembered the grain structure in the fracture lines she'd chipped open with a chisel last Saturday, tight, uniform, no porosity. Good metal. Wasted. Her father would say nothing's wasted if you know how to read it. She'd spent childhood afternoons watching him ream out worn bearings in tractor parts, his stocky frame bent over the workbench, silver-gray hair pulled back in its low bun. Now, she copied the manganese percentage into her notebook, 1.2%, critical for vibration damping. The reason these looms lasted decades in European mills. Let me tell you about rust removal chemistry, because you need to understand vinegar before you can understand why Aliner's first test cost her $8.40. She needed to prove the frames weren't compromised. That Saturday, she dragged a loom gear assembly to the granary. The vinegar smell stung her eyes as she soaked the part in a 50-gallon drum. She decalculated the solution, 1 part white vinegar to 3 parts water, heated to 110 degrees. The acetic acid would dissolve the iron oxide without attacking the base metal. She checked it every 2 hours, her denim jacket sleeves rolled up, freckles stark against her pale skin in the granary's weak light. After 12 hours, she pulled it out. The rust was gone, not scrubbed, dissolved. Underneath, the casting numbers gleamed, HIWT14. Her hands shook as she measured the pitting depth with her father's micrometer. Less than 1,000th of an inch. Within tolerance. She'd read it in the Singer manual. Surface pitting under .005 inches does not affect structural integrity in static load applications. The loom frames were static load. They'd held up for 40 years. They'd hold up again. She wrote the cost in her notebook. Vinegar $2.30, water free, time 8 hours, total $2.30 per gear. She added it to the ledger forming in her mind. Bearings would be the real cost. New ones ran $40 each at the co-op, but she could regrind the old ones. Her father's worn grinding stone sat unused in the red shed. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at something everyone called trash and saw the exact chemical process that could bring it back? Aliner knew the vinegar trick from a farm journal her mother had saved. She'd found it wrapped around a seed packet in the kitchen drawer. The article was from 1939, Homemade Solutions for Farm Machinery Maintenance. She'd read it while eating oatmeal that morning, steam fogging her glasses. She copied the bearing regrind specs into her notebook. 1,000 grit emery cloth. 3 passes at 15 degrees. She'd test it tomorrow. But first, pricing. She needed hard numbers. She rode her bicycle to the county courthouse the next afternoon, the leather notebook clutched to her chest. Property records showed the looms were covered under the 1984 lease clause her father had made her read years ago. Abandoned equipment reverts to landowner after 6 months. The farm had owned them since 1985. They were hers. Free. She sat at the courthouse steps, the Iowa sun warm on her shoulders, and calculated 1,400 looms. At $850 each, that was $1,190,000. Minus restoration. Bearings, $240 per loom. Rust removal, $10. Labor, her time. She wrote it line by line. The vise, $8. The grinding tools, $22. Vinegar for the first winter, $14. Welding rod, $3.40. Total, $84.85 to prove the process worked. She stared at the number. $84.85 against $1,190,000. Her pen hovered. Then she added plus museum value for historical accuracy. She'd read about it in the Musée des Tissus auction notice. Collectors paid premiums for original parts. Let me tell you about Textile Museum auction records. because you need to understand why a faded clipping in the Lyon Gazette mattered more than Harlan Briggs' laugh. Alina found the microfiche machine in the library's basement, its hum the only sound in the concrete room. She threaded the reel for 1984, the date burning in her mind. Lyon Gazette, March 12th. There it was. Musée des Tissus acquires rare Hawthorne looms. The photo showed 3 T14s, their frames gleaming under museum lights. The caption listed the price, $850 per unit. But below it, a detail Harlan Briggs would never see, additional 15,000 francs awarded for verified original components. She copied the franc conversion, about $2,000 total. Small change for a museum, life-changing for a farmer. Her finger landed on the line, Hawthorne Model T14, collectible in European textile museums. The words blurred slightly. She blinked hard. This wasn't scrap. This was material that had already been engineered, worked, and proven. Free only because everyone else had stopped seeing it. She thought of Harlan's polished brown brogues tapping the feed store floor as he dismissed her. You're chasing ghosts, Ellie, but ghosts didn't have manganese content specs. Ghosts didn't dissolve rust in vinegar baths. She closed the microfiche reader, the basement suddenly cold. Outside, the courthouse clock struck 5. She walked home through Mill Creek's empty streets, the leather notebook pressed to her chest like a shield. The numbers were real. The process was real. The only question left was whether her father would believe it. She rehearsed the cost analysis in her head, item by item, no rounding, no estimates. $84.85 to start. She'd lay it all on the kitchen table tomorrow. Let him say no. She'd already seen the proof. Her finger had landed on it. The red shed key felt heavy in her pocket as she turned onto her family's gravel drive. Robert's truck sat silent by the barn, its headlights catching the last light. He'd be at the kitchen table, reading the evening paper, his brass pocket watch ticking on the oilcloth. She'd show him the notebook, the vinegar test results, the auction records, the $84.85. She stopped at the fence line, looking out at the looms standing like tombstones in the field. Harlan Briggs saw scrap. Her father saw engineering discipline. And Alina Vance, with her auburn hair pulled back and wire-rimmed glasses catching the sunset, saw something else entirely. She saw the grain structure in the rust. She saw the vinegar dissolving the past. She saw 1,400 futures waiting in the iron. She touched the chipped thumbnail that had caught on the Lyon Gazette page. Tomorrow, she'd ask for permission. Tonight, she'd sleep knowing the numbers didn't lie. The looms weren't trash. They were treasure written off by everyone who didn't know how to read metal. She walked toward the house, her work boots crunching on the gravel, the leather notebook held tight against the wind. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1, context bridge, 1E slot 2, section transition, 4B slot 3, final reflection, 8G slot 4, opening turn, 9H. Let me tell you about the quiet terror of waiting for permission, because you need to understand the weight of a kitchen table before you can understand what happened in Mill Creek that October. Alina Vance pushed open the screen door, the aluminum frame groaning like an old hinge. Inside, the smell of boiled potatoes and machine oil hung in the air, the same as it had every evening since she could remember. Her father Robert sat at the Formica table, his brass pocket watch open in his palm, the face reflecting the single bare bulb overhead. He was a retired machinist from the Cedar Rapids plant, a man who'd spent 32 years measuring tolerances down to the thousandth of an inch. His silver-gray hair pulled back in a low bun, the birthmark like a smudge of charcoal on his left jaw. He never raised his voice, never wasted a word. When he spoke, the room listened. Most people see a pile of rusted iron and they see scrap metal. Robert Vance saw the ghost of a machine that once wove cloth for uniforms in the Second World War. He saw the cost of replacing a bearing, the hours of labor to true a warped casting. He saw risk where others saw rust. Alina laid her leather notebook flat on the table, the spine cracking as it opened. Her wire-rimmed glasses slipped down her nose, the freckles across her cheekbones standing out against the pallor of her skin. She'd spent 3 days calculating, cross-referencing, measuring, every figure checked twice. The notebook held the lifeline. She slid it toward him, the pages whispering, $84.85. That was the cost to restore one Hawthorne iron loom model T14, not the dealer price, not some hopeful guess. The actual cost of materials she could get for free or nearly free. The vise, $8. The fryer tools, $22. Coal for the first winter, 14. Welding rod, $3.40. Total, $84.85. She'd de-written it out line by line, the numbers marching down the page like soldiers. She didn't say a word. Just tapped the total with her index finger, the callus from years of handling wrenches pressing into the paper. Robert didn't touch the notebook. He didn't lean forward. He just stared at it, his gray eyes narrowing behind the magnifying glass he kept clipped to his vest. The silence stretched. Outside, a pickup truck rumbled past on the county road, the sound fading into the cornfields. Let me tell you about the difference between a number and a promise, because you need to understand why Robert Vance didn't reach for that ledger. A number is something you write down. A promise is something you stake your family's land on. He finally spoke, his voice low, the kind of voice that made you lean in to hear. "Where's the market, Ellie? Who's buying restored looms in Harlan County?" He said it like he was asking where the rain had gone that summer, simple and unanswerable. He knew the co-op books. Knew the margins on corn were shrinking faster than a wool sweater in hot water. Knew Harlan Briggs at the feed store had already laughed this idea into his coffee cup that morning. You think Harlan Briggs is the only one who thinks you're chasing ghosts. Robert pushed the magnifying glass up his nose. "I need proof this isn't just metal waiting to be hauled to the landfill. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you stood in a room with someone you loved, knowing one sentence could change everything, and you couldn't make them see it?" Alina felt the heat rise in her chest, the same heat she'd felt when Harlan Briggs leaned against the counter, his gold wedding band catching the light as he shook his head. Son of a bitch hadn't even looked at the looms, just spat his tobacco juice into the can and said, "Girl, you're wasting good daylight." But Robert was Harlan. Robert was the man who'd taught her to read micrometers before she could drive, who'd shown her how to spot a hairline crack in cast iron by the way the light caught it. He deserved the truth, not a sales pitch, so she gave him the facts. The Hawthorne Model T14 wasn't scrap, it was a museum piece. European textile historians paid good money for them. She'd found it in a 1952 Singer engineering manual at the county library, the page marked with a scrap of burlap. The looms were rare, collectible. The lease clause from 1984 meant the landowner got anything left behind when the mill closed. Nobody else knew. Nobody else cared. She'd seen the numbers in black and white. One restored loom could sell for $390. Profit, $305.15 per machine. 1,400 looms sat in that field. The math was simple. The risk was hers alone to take. Robert stood up slowly, the chair legs scraping against the linoleum. He walked to the window, his Oxfords clicking on the floor. Outside, the last light of day bled across the cornfield, turning the stalks to gold. He'd seen droughts before, seen neighbors lose everything because they gambled on a crop that never came. He'd survived by not borrowing, not expanding, not chasing shiny new ideas. His hands rested on the sill, the knuckles swollen from years of turning wrenches. 3 days, he said without turning. "I need 3 days to check your numbers, every figure, every source." He turned then, his square jaw set, the birthmark dark against his skin. "If one number's wrong, this ends, you understand." His voice didn't waver, didn't soften. It was the voice of a man who'd seen too many shortcuts turn into dead ends. Alina nodded. She didn't argue, didn't beg. Just closed her notebook with a soft thud, the leather cover cool under her palm. She knew what 3 days meant. It meant Robert would drive to the county seat, pull old engineering journals from the library basement. It meant he'd call contacts from his machinist days, verify every tolerance, every material cost. It meant he wouldn't sleep until he'd proven her right or wrong. That's how he'd survived. That's how he'd taught her to work. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The corn was still green in the fields, the co-op payment steady. That didn't last, not in Harlan County, not in 1987. She left the kitchen, the screen door slamming behind her. Night had fallen, the sky thick with stars. She walked back toward the granary, her boots silent on the packed earth. The looms stood in the field like tombstones, their iron frames black against the moonlight. She ran her hand along the cold metal of the nearest one, feeling the pitting where rust had eaten into the surface. She pulled a small caliper from her jacket pocket, the same one Robert had given her when she was 12, measured the wear on a gear tooth. 0.07 of an inch, within spec. She checked the frame alignment with a spirit level from her tool belt, still true. The machine was tired, not broken. just waiting for someone to see what it could still do. Let me tell you about the moment doubt hits, because you need to understand why Alina sat on that rusted loom base until dawn. It wasn't the numbers that scared her. It was the silence, the waiting. The knowledge that her father's approval was the only thing standing between her and the red shed where she'd start the work. She thought about Harlan Briggs's laugh, the way it had echoed in the feed store. Thought about the neighbors who'd already started placing bets on how long it would take her to quit. The notebook felt heavy in her pocket. She'd done everything right, learned the metallurgy from library books, mastered the casting tolerances from a discarded vocational manual, found the lease clause nobody else had read, but none of it mattered if Robert said no. She closed her eyes, the wind carrying the scent of dry earth. For the first time, quitting felt possible, not smart. Not right, but possible. Morning came hard. She found Robert already at the table, the brass pocket watch ticking beside a stack of papers. His eyes were red-rimmed, the magnifying glass lying open next to a dog-eared copy of the 1952 Singer manual. He didn't look up as she entered. Just slid the ledger toward her, the pages covered in his tight, precise handwriting. He'd added notes in the margins, calculations verifying her coal costs, her welding rod estimates. He'd even tracked down a retired machinist in Davenport who'd worked on Hawthorne looms in the 1940s. The man confirmed the restoration specs. Robert had done his homework, done it better than she had. Alina's throat tightened. She hadn't slept. He hadn't either. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "You found the lease clause," he said. "The one that reverts abandoned equipment to the landowner." She nodded. He de-verified that too. It was real. It was hers. He picked up the magnifying glass, studied the notebook again, the light catching the silver in his hair. The silence stretched, longer than before, heavy with everything unsaid. He turned a page, checked a figure, turned another. The clock on the wall ticked. The coffee in his mug went cold. Let me tell you about the sound of a decision being made, because you need to understand why Robert Vance's next words would echo in Alina's bones for the next 37 years. It wasn't the answer. It was the weight behind it. The years of caution, the decades of watching good people lose everything because they didn't check the numbers twice. He closed the notebook slowly, the leather cover soft from years of use. He stood up, his Oxfords creaking on the linoleum. He walked to the sink, stared out at the cornfield where the stalks were already starting to yellow at the edges. The drought was coming. Everyone knew it. He turned back, his hand resting on the brass faucet, the birthmark stark in the morning light. "I need to think about it," he said. And then he left the room. The screen door didn't slam this time. It just clicked shut behind him, the sound hanging in the air like a question mark. Alina sat alone at the table, the empty chair across from her, the brass pocket watch still ticking on the formica. The numbers were right. The proof was there. But the permission was, not yet. She picked up the magnifying glass, the glass cool against her skin, and waited. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1, context bridge. 1E slot 2, section transition. 4B slot 3, final reflection. 8G slot 4, opening turn. 9H. Robert Vance handed Alina the slip of paper, the brass pocket watch in his palm catching the kitchen light as he did. "You know what that piece of paper said?" It said yes. It said use the red shed behind the machine shop. It said he had read her $84.85 cost analysis twice, line by line, and found it wanting only in one place, the line for coal. He added $4.20 himself in neat pencil. The condition came clear when he spoke, his voice low, and even the way it got when he meant business. No family savings. Not one dime from the farm account. If this went south, it went south on her nickel alone. Alina nodded, the wire-rim glasses slipping slightly on her nose as she did. She folded the permission slip carefully, tucking it into the small leather-bound notebook already worn soft at the edges. Her father watched her for a long moment, the silver hair pulled back tight at his neck, the faint birthmark visible along his jawline. Then he turned without another word and walked out the back door toward the workshop. Let me tell you about those tools in Robert Vance's workshop, because you need to understand what kind of man leaves a legacy in calipers. The room smelled of machine oil and dried sweat, of decades of hands working metal down to its true shape. Alina moved through the space like she knew every shadow. She pulled open the top drawer of his main bench. There they were. The brass calipers, heavy and cool, their measuring points worn smooth from use. Her grandfather had carried them. Her father had carried them. Now they'd measure the thickness of rust on hawthorn iron loom parts nobody else wanted. She wrapped them in an old grain sack, the same way Robert always did. She took the steel wool too, coarse grade, and a 5-gallon bucket someone had given him for scrap. She took the wire brush with the wooden handle split clean through the middle. She took the vinegar, not the fancy kind. The cheap, sharp-smelling stuff sold in gallon jugs at the Mill Creek Feed and Seed. She carried it all out to the red shed, the denim jacket sleeves pushed up past her elbows, the auburn hair escaping its tie in wisps across her forehead. The shed door groaned on its hinges, the sound loud in the still afternoon. For a while things actually seemed fine. The vinegar bit into the rust like it was born to do the job. She worked methodically, dipping steel wool into the bucket, scrubbing the iron surfaces clean. The smell filled the space, sharp and sour, mixing with the old hay dust hanging in the air. She measured the thickness of key components with the brass calipers, recording each number in her notebook. 1.2 inches for the main drive shaft, 0.8 inches for the shuttle race housing. The numbers felt solid, real. She scrubbed for hours, the vinegar stinging small cuts on her knuckles, the denim jacket darkening with sweat across the shoulders. She felt the rhythm of it, the scrape and splash, the slow reveal of the engineered iron beneath the red decay. This wasn't junk. This was material that had already been proven, forged and cast to last. It was free only because everyone else had stopped seeing it. Harlan Briggs saw scrap metal worth $50 a ton. Robert Vance saw a daughter risking her own money on a fool's errand. Eleanor Vance saw the tolerances in the cast iron, the precision milling marks still visible beneath the rust. She saw what it could become. And then she found the bearings, deep inside the loom frame where the main drive shaft connected to the shuttle mechanism. They were seized solid. No amount of vinegar soaking or wire brushing would free them. She tried gentle taps with a brass hammer. Nothing. She tried penetrating oil, the kind sold in small cans at Briggs' co-op counter. It pooled on the surface but wouldn't seep into the corrosion. She worked them for 2 full days, her hands raw, the notebook filling with frustrated notes. Bearing race diameter, 3.75 inches. Corrosion depth, 0.15 inches minimum. Resistance, total. She knew the numbers meant trouble. The thermal expansion coefficient for cast iron was 0.000065 per degree Fahrenheit. She'd read it in the Singer manual. If the bearings were stuck now, heat from actual operation would only lock them tighter. She needed a specialized lubricant, something that could creep into that microscopic gap. Something Briggs wouldn't carry at the co-op. Something she couldn't afford to buy. She didn't quit. Not then. She went back to the vinegar bucket. She mixed it with coarse salt, creating a weak electrolyte. She rigged copper wires from an old extension cord, connecting the positive terminal to the bearing housing, the negative to the shaft itself. She hooked it to the truck battery sitting idle in the shed corner. Electrolysis. A trick she'd read about in a discarded Popular Mechanics from 1979, found tucked behind the radiator at the library. She let it run overnight. The next morning, the vinegar solution bubbled faintly around the bearings. The rust had loosened. Not enough to free them completely, but enough to see a path forward. She felt a flicker of something like hope. She wiped her hands on her jeans, the scuffed brown work boots planted firmly on the packed dirt floor. She'd get them moving. She had to. She spent the 3rd day carefully working the bearings loose with a brass hammer and a drift punch. Tiny taps, patient, relentless. The cast iron groaned but held. Finally, the shaft turned, just a fraction, then a full quarter turn. She fitted the shuttle race housing back into place, her fingers tracing the smooth-milled groove where the shuttle would travel. She connected the drive belt to the small electric motor she'd borrowed from the shop. She stood back. She flipped the switch. The motor whined. The belt tightened. The drive shaft turned. The shuttle mechanism began its back-end fourth motion. It moved smoothly for exactly 17 seconds. Then a sharp crack split the air. Eleanor froze. She killed the power. She knelt beside the loom, the smell of hot metal sharp in her nose. There it was. A hairline fracture running through the shuttle race housing, right where the bearing pressed against it. The cast iron had given way under the stress. Her notebook lay open on the workbench. She picked it up, her thumb tracing the number she'd written just that morning. Thermal expansion coefficient, 0.000065. She miscalculated the margin. The material couldn't handle the combined stress of the bearing fit and the operational heat. The housing had warped slightly during the initial cleaning, creating an uneven load path. The numbers hadn't lied, she had. She missed the cumulative effect. The failure sat there in the red shed, cold and undeniable. The first crude version built in the granary had failed. Not spectacularly, but completely. She didn't curse. She didn't throw the brass calipers across the room. She sat down on an upturned crate, the leather-bound notebook open on her knee, the pale blue eyes fixed on the cracked housing. The silence stretched. Outside, a crow cawed once, sharply, the only sound in the whole county. She thought about Harlan Briggs' laugh echoing off the co-op counter just weeks before. She thought about the $84.85 already spent. She thought about the red shed standing empty behind the machine shop, a space granted but not yet earned. Quitting was on the table. It sat there heavy and real. She closed her eyes. She felt the freckles warm on her nose from the afternoon sun slanting through the shed window. She opened her eyes. She picked up the wire brush. The failure taught something specific. The fix would make the system stronger. She knew what the problem was. Thermal expansion, uneven load, warped housing. The solution had to address all three. She needed to understand the grain structure of this specific cast iron, how it moved under stress. She needed to find a way to relieve the pressure points without compromising the structural integrity. She needed to see what everyone else had written off and see what it could still become. She dipped the steel wool back into the vinegar bucket. She knelt beside the fractured housing. She began brushing the rust from the first loom gear, her movements slow, deliberate, the determination settling into her bones like the iron itself. The shed filled again with the scrape of steel on iron, the only sound besides her steady breathing. The work wasn't done. It had just begun. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1 context bridge, 1E slot 2 section transition, 4B slot 3 final reflection, 8G slot 4 opening turn, 9H. On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Emmett Vandermeer stood in the gravel lot behind his machine shop in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched a 17-year-old boy drag a cracked engine block out of his scrap pile without asking permission. The work wasn't done. It had just begun. Damn right it was. Ellie Vance's knuckles were raw inside her faded blue denim jacket sleeves, her wire-rimmed glasses smudged with grease as she wrestled the Hawthorne Iron Looms main drive gear. 2 tons of cast iron stubborn as a mule with lockjaw. She braced the wrench against the granary wall, thrown her whole 5 feet 7 inches of lean frame against it. Nothing, not a shudder. The gear teeth were fused shut with decades of rust and neglect, the corrosion forming brittle iron oxide crystals that had grown like roots into the metal's grain structure. She could feel the vibration in her molars when she slammed the wrench handle with a copper mallet, solid, unyielding, mocking. Her pale blue eyes burned behind those smudged lenses, not from sweat, but the sting of frustration. This was the 3rd seized assembly this week, each one a brick wall. Her military straight posture finally slumped, shoulders sagging under the weight of what everyone else saw as junk. How does a person get a 2-ton gear to move when brute force fails? Ellie knew the answer wasn't in her muscles. It lived in the brittle chemistry of rust itself. She wiped her hands on her worn jeans, the scuffed brown work boots scraping gravel as she marched toward her pickup. The county library in Mill Creek smelled of dust and aging paper, the kind of quiet where even breathing feels loud. She pulled down the Singer engineering manuals from 1952, the brittle pages whispering secrets. Her finger traced a diagram of corrosion conversion, phosphoric acid reacting with Phe2O3 to form ferric phosphate, a stable black compound that wouldn't expand and seize. 1 part phosphoric acid to 3 parts distilled water, heated to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Simple, elegant. The kind of knowledge someone paid good money for in a textbook, but here it was, free as the looms themselves, waiting in the library's forgotten stacks. She copied the formula into her small leather-bound notebook, the ink bleeding slightly on the cheap paper. Precision mattered. Too much acid and it'd eat the base metal. Too little and the rust stayed put. For a while, things actually seemed fine. She'd mixed the solution in a 5-gallon bucket behind the granary, the sharp tang of phosphoric acid burning her throat as she brushed it onto the gear teeth. The rust hissed and darkened, turning from flaky orange to smooth black. That didn't last. 2 days later, the gear was tighter than before. The ferric phosphate had formed, sure, but it acted like glue, cementing the assembly shut. She kicked the bucket, sending a wave of the useless mixture sloshing onto the dirt. Damn it. She followed the formula exactly. What wasn't in the books was how Midwestern humidity and decades of oil contamination changed the reaction. Humidity accelerated oxidation. Oil created barriers where the acid couldn't penetrate. The chemistry was sound, but the real world was a son of a bitch. She drove into Mill Creek, the pickup rattling over railroad tracks, heading straight for Pritchard Machine Shop. Walter Pritchard had run the place since the 1930s, his hands stained with oil no soap could touch. The shop smelled of hot metal and cutting fluid, lathes humming like sleeping beasts. Ellie unrolled her notebook on Walter's workbench, the pages flapping in the draft from an open door. She pointed to her measurements, gear shaft diameter at 2.75 inches, tolerance plus or minus 0.005. "This gear won't budge," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "I need a puller that can grip without crushing the shaft." Walter adjusted his thick safety glasses, leaning in. His coveralls were oil-stained up to the chest, but his hands were steady as he traced her numbers with a calloused finger. He'd seen 1,000 farm boys bring in bent axles and cracked pistons, but never a woman with measurements this precise. Never someone who knew the difference between a taper lock and a straight bore. And then Harlan Briggs pushed through the screen door, his navy blue work shirt straining over his broad shoulders, the red plaid vest buttoned tight. He spotted Ellie and let out that laugh, the deep, rumbling sound of a man who'd seen every fool scheme in Hardin County. "Still playing with junk, Ellie," he said, shaking his head, the single dimple on his left cheek creasing as he grinned. "You're wasting good daylight. Those looms are scrap metal, always were." He pulled his silver fountain pen from the vest pocket, tapping it against his palm like he was signing her failure. "I've told you a dozen times, nobody pays for rust buckets. Go check your corn rows." His voice dropped, low and patronizing, like he was explaining gravity to a child. "You'll never make a dime off that graveyard out back." Ellie didn't flinch, didn't look up from her notebook. She just slid the pages toward Walter. "The bearing seized at the interference fit," she said, tapping the shaft measurement. "I need a puller that applies even pressure radially, not axially." Walter's eyes flicked from her numbers to Harlan, then back. He'd been a machinist for 50 years. He knew what he was hearing. This wasn't some farmer's guesswork. This was textbook precision. Harlan's laugh died in his throat when Walter didn't join in. The co-op manager shifted his polished brown brogues, hands shoved into his pockets, that shuffle of his saying everything he wouldn't out loud. He'd been wrong before, just not often, and never in front of witnesses. He mumbled something about crop reports and backed out the door, the screen slamming behind him like a period at the end of a sentence. Walter wiped his hands on a rag, the silence heavy with the weight of what Harlan had just missed. "You know," he said, his voice gravelly from years of machine noise, "most folks see a seized gear and they see a lost cause." He walked to a shadowed corner of the shop, kicking aside wood shavings. "My daddy saw something else." He bent down, heaving open a rusted metal cabinet. Inside lay tools older than Ellie, files with wooden handles, calipers with tarnished brass. He pulled out a bearing puller, its steel arms curved and elegant, stamped with a date, 1938. "Hawthorne used these in their textile plants," he said, handing it to her. The puller felt alive in her hands, the weight balanced, the threads smooth. "This here, made for loom bearings, fits the taper perfectly." He pointed to a faded label on the cabinet. "Belonged to the old Mill Creek Textile Works, shut down in 1943. My daddy kept it just in case." Ellie ran her thumb over the puller's teeth, feeling the precision grind. This was why the library manual hadn't been enough. Real knowledge lived in tools like this, passed down through hands that remembered. Walter watched her, his expression unreadable. "You've got the numbers right," he said finally. "But numbers don't lie flat. They bend with the metal." He tapped the puller's central screw. "Heat the bearing race to 150 degrees, just enough to expand the metal. Then this'll walk it right off." He didn't ask why she needed it, didn't warn her about Harlan or the neighbors. He'd seen her measurements. He knew. She carried the puller back to the granary as the sun dipped low, the weight solid and sure in her arms. That night she heated the bearing race with a propane torch, the metal glowing a dull cherry red. The puller's arms locked into place, the central screw biting into the shaft. She turned the handle. Once, twice, a groan of stressed metal. Then silence. The bearing slid free, smooth as butter, the rust converted not by chemistry but by physics and patience. She held it in her palm, the metal still warm, the surface flawless. $11.40 in materials against a $390 dealer part. The numbers were real. The proof was in her hands. Walter Pritchard handed her a custom puller from his machine shop. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1, context bridge, 1E slot 2 section transition, 4B slot 3, final reflection, 8G slot 4 opening turn, 9H. The steel jaws bit into the rusted gear with a sound like cracking ice. Eleanor Vance tightened the puller's spindle, her wire-rimmed glasses fogging slightly in the Granaries' chill. She braced her scuffed brown work boots against the hawthorn iron Looms cast-iron frame, shoulders straining. A metallic groan echoed off the plank walls. Then sudden release. The seized gear assembly parted from the shaft with a hiss of dislodged rust. She caught it before it hit the dirt floor, hefting the 60-pound chunk of steel. Under the grime, the original machining marks gleamed. Precise, parallel lines scored by a craftsman who'd known exactly how hard iron could bend before it broke. Walter Pritchard had forged this puller in his machine shop overnight, using scrap steel from his own burn pile. He said nothing when he handed it over, just tapped the tool's handle twice with his wrench. Now Eleanor saw why. Most people see a rusted gear and they see junk. Walter saw geometry waiting to be proven. Let me tell you about lanolin, because you need to understand why tannery scraps matter before you can understand how Eleanor got that loom singing. The Mill Creek Hide Tannery paid the county $20 a month to haul away their offcuts, sheepskins too irregular for belts, soaked in wool grease nobody wanted. Eleanor had collected 5 gallons of that grease over 3 months, simmering it with vinegar in an old canning kettle behind her granary. She skimmed the purified lanolin into mason jars, the same chipped ones the local bottling plant was landfilling. Now she smeared the pale yellow compound onto the loom's bearings, her fingers working the grease into crevices where rust had bled. It smelled like wet wool and vinegar, sharp and clean. The lanolin wouldn't gum up like motor oil in winter, wouldn't wash out like grease in summer. It was what the Hawthorne engineers had specified in 1923, back when they built these looms to run in Yorkshire mills, where fog seeped into everything. Eleanor knew this because she'd pored over the brittle 1952 Singer engineering manual at the county library, tracing the diagrams with her fingertip until the paper tore. The shuttle glided. On the first test run, Eleanor held her breath as the loom's harnesses lifted the warp threads. She'd restrung the heddles with salvaged cotton cord from a grain sack, knotted them tight as her father had taught her for repairing fence wire. The shuttle shot through the shed at 180 picks per minute, smooth, steady, no hesitation. A perfect weave emerged on the cloth beam, tight, even, the threads kissing without a single skipped pick. She touched the fabric, still warm from the motion. It felt like sunlight on skin. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you saw something broken come back to life exactly as it was meant to? Not fixed, restored. She didn't smile. She reached for her leather-bound notebook, flipping past sketches of gear teeth and calculations for belt tension, and wrote, "First swatch, 11 inches long, 0 defects." Let me tell you about the numbers, because you need to understand what $84.85 can do before you can understand why Harlan Briggs started measuring things. Eleanor laid out the costs on the granary workbench, her father's brass pocket watch ticking beside the ledger. The vise, $8 bought at the Granger farm sale. The fryer tools for melting lanolin, $22, salvaged from a closed diner. Coal for the first winter's heat, $14, dug from the slag pile behind the railroad depot. Welding rod, $3.40, scrap ends Walter Pritchard had given her. Total, $84.85. Against that, the dealer price for a single replacement gear assembly was $390. She checked the catalog Harlan kept under the counter at the Mill Creek Co-op. $390, a number that could choke a small farmer in 1988. But here it was, $11.40 in materials against $390. The arithmetic held. It always had. Her father had seen it too, that kitchen night when she'd spread the figures across the oilcloth table. He'd read every line, his square jaw tight, then said he needed to think about it. 3 days later, he'd handed her the permission slip for the red shed. Use the red shed, he'd written in his blocky script. No ceremony, just proof. Word traveled the way water travels on flat ground. By Tuesday, the men at the Mill Creek feed store were swapping stories about Eleanor Vance's granary. Old man Henderson claimed he'd heard the loom running clear across County Road 52. Betty Lou Jenkins swore she'd seen steam rising from the roof at dawn. Harlan Briggs listened from his usual stool by the kerosene heaters, polishing the silver fountain pen clipped to his red plaid vest. He said nothing until Clem Dawson asked if it was true. Harlan's laugh started low, a chuckle that rumbled up from his broad chest. Then it opened into something full-throated, warm as the heaters, the sound of a man who'd seen 100 schemes turn to dust. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing, not cruel, never cruel. Just the sound of 19 years behind the co-op counter, meeting something unfamiliar and mistaking unfamiliar for impossible. A loom, Ellie, he'd said later, leaning against her granary door, the late October sun gilding the rust on the hawthorn frames. You're paying to haul scrap iron, then spending Sundays making it pretty. His dimple flashed, but his deep brown eyes stayed fixed on the loom's flywheel. He didn't wait for her answer, just pulled a tape measure from his vest pocket and snapped it against the gear housing. 112 inches. He wrote the number in his own ledger, the cover stained with motor oil. Then he walked back to his pickup without another word. The tape measure stayed in his hand. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The loom ran through that first week without a hitch, weaving swatches Eleanor sold to the quilt shop in Newton for $8 apiece. She reinvested every cent into more lanolin jars, more salvaged cord. The red shed became her workshop, the smell of wool grease and hot iron a constant. Her father brought her thermoses of coffee at dawn, nodding at the ledger where she tracked costs against revenue. But then the shuttle jammed again. Not rust this time. A hairline crack in the reed sleigh, the part that beat the weft into place. She demissed it during inspection, a flaw hidden under decades of grime. The loom shuddered, threw a belt, and fell silent. Eleanor sat on the dirt floor that night, her yellow cotton t-shirt streaked with grease, the leather notebook open to a blank page. Quitting was on the table. The numbers stared back, $84.85, a drop in the ocean against what Harlan would call real farming. Outside, the wind moaned through the corn stubble. She closed the notebook, went back to the tannery scraps. The fix was simple. She debraided 3 strands of the strongest cotton cord she had, doubling the tension on the reed sleigh. It took 2 hours, her fingers raw from the fibers. But when she restarted the loom at dawn, the shuttle flew truer than before. 180 picks per minute. The crack held. The weave tightened. She ran 10 continuous yards of cloth, the threads locking together like clasped hands. This was the moment the doubters couldn't unsee. Not the cost savings, though that mattered. Not the engineering, though that was real. It was the sound, a steady, rhythmic clack-clack-clack that said, I am working. I am alive. She cut the first full swatch free, folding it carefully into her notebook. The fabric felt substantial, resilient, ready for anything. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s. It turned land payments into nightmares. It made banks call in notes before the wheat was ripe. It left grain silos full but farmers broke, watching their acres auctioned off while combined dealers repossessed equipment still stained with this year's harvest. But Eleanor's loom didn't care about interest rates. It ran on lanolin and scrap steel, on gear assemblies pulled from rust piles for free. It asked for no loan, carried no debt. When the drought came in 1988 and corn stalks turned to dust, this loom kept weaving. Because what the world paid to get rid of, the cracked blocks, the chipped jars, the rusted gears, was the only thing that couldn't be taken away. Harlan Briggs knew this now. He'd seen the measurements. He'd heard the clack-clack-clack carry across his own fallow fields, and though he wouldn't say it yet, the numbers didn't lie. $11.40 against $390, a loom that survived drought because it was never exposed to the risk that broke everyone else. Eleanor ran her palm over the fresh swatch. No flaws. No weak spots. Just clean, strong cloth, the warp threads holding the weft in perfect tension. She didn't call Walter, didn't fetch her father, just sat on the workbench, the granary door open to the pale Iowa sky, and watched the shuttle fly, back and forth, back and forth. The sound filled the space where doubt had lived. It was the sound of something seen clearly for the first time. Not scrap, material, waiting. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1, context bridge, 1E slot 2, section transition, 4B slot 3, final reflection, 8G slot 4, opening turn, 9H. On a Tuesday morning in October 1987, Dr. Klaus Weber stepped out of a charcoal Volkswagen Beetle in Mill Creek, Iowa, and walked straight toward Eleanor Vance's red granary without knocking. His shoes left clean prints in the dust where Harlan Briggs's laughter had kicked up gravel just weeks before. Eleanor was elbow-deep in the third, restored Hawthorne iron loom model T14, her wire-rim glasses smudged with machine oil, when he appeared in the doorway holding a German trade journal open to a photograph. The photo showed her very loom, the one she'd coaxed back to life over 3 sleepless nights, printed in crisp black and white beneath the headline verse column, Hawthorne T14 Webstuhl. Lost. She wiped her hands on her faded blue denim jacket and waited. He didn't introduce himself. He pointed at the gear assembly she just polished. Let me tell you about gear teeth, because you need to understand why this mattered to a man who'd flown across an ocean. Most people see rust, and they see junk. Robert Vance saw salvage value in scrap iron. Dr. Weber saw something else entirely, a language written in steel. He ran a gloved finger along the tooth profile, then pulled a micrometer from his coat pocket. The measurement had to be precise, 1/1000th of an inch. He checked the casting seam where molten iron had cooled nearly 70 years earlier. Perfect. No porosity, no stress fractures. He turned the journal toward her so she could see the same loom photographed in a Berlin textile museum, its patent date stamp clearly visible, 1914, the exact year this machine was born. Eleanor reached for her small leather-bound notebook, the spine cracked from constant use, and flipped to a page where she'd copied the Hawthorne factory specifications from a 1952 Singer engineering manual. Her father had taught her that numbers don't lie, but they do hide. She showed Weber the tolerance range, plus or minus 0.02 of an inch. His micrometer read exactly 1.8 thousandths, within spec, after 73 years. After sitting in a cornfield through 2 droughts and a flood, Weber nodded once sharply and pulled a magnifying glass from his vest. He examined the patent stamp on the loom's main frame, Hawthorne Iron Works Chicago patented MCMXIV. The Roman numerals were still crisp, not worn smooth by time. He looked up, his eyes bright behind thick lenses. He spoke in careful English with a German accent that made every word land like a hammer on an anvil. This machine is not scrap. It is history, it is engineering, it is worth more than gold to us. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you held something broken and saw not the crack but the blueprint for how to make it whole again? Most people see a rusted hulk and they see landfill. Robert Vance saw a $70 tax write-off. Dr. Weber saw a museum centerpiece. Eleanor saw what she'd always seen, material waiting. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She walked to the loom's tensioning lever and gave it a quarter turn. Then she threaded fresh cotton warp through the heddles, her movements economical practiced. She kicked the foot pedal. The loom shuddered once, then settled into a steady rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. A perfect weave emerged, the threads tight and even, no snags, no breaks. She decalibrated the tension to within 0.05 pounds of the original factory setting, using nothing but a fish scale from the tackle shop and a notebook full of trial-and-error calculations. Weber watched the cloth grow, inch by inch, his expression unreadable. When the shuttle stopped, he touched the fabric. He held it to the light. He smelled it. Then he said 3 words that made Eleanor's heart stop. It is authentic. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The loom ran smooth. That didn't last. Weber pulled a second journal from his satchel, this one British, dated 1984. He turned to a page marked with a ribbon and showed her a clause buried in a lease agreement for abandoned industrial equipment. The clause stated that if machinery remained on leased land for more than 10 years without payment, ownership reverted to the landowner. Eleanor had found that clause in the county courthouse basement 2 months earlier, hidden in a box of deed records nobody had opened since 1959. She'd copied it into her notebook in neat block letters. Weber pointed at the exact line. You knew these were not scrap. You knew they were yours. Eleanor adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, the light catching the faint freckles across her nose. I knew the iron was worth $5 a ton to the recycler. I knew the history was worth more. She didn't say she'd spent 17 nights in the Hardin County Library chasing down patent records while her corn crop withered in the field. She didn't say Robert had handed her the red shed keys with a grunt and a warning about wasting good daylight. She just stood there, smelling of machine oil and determination, while Weber studied her like she'd performed a miracle. Let me tell you about metallurgy, because you need to understand why this moment cost Harlan Briggs his pride. Most people see rust, and they see decay. Robert Vance saw oxidation they could sand off. Dr. Weber saw proof of Hawthorne's proprietary iron blend, a mix of nickel and molybdenum that prevented crystalline fatigue even after decades in the elements. He showed Alina the stress test results from the Berlin Museum's archives. These looms were designed to run 20,000 hours, most never saw 5,000. Hers had been idle, but the metal remembered its purpose. He tapped the main drive shaft. This casting could outlive us all. Alina pulled her notebook open to a page where she'd sketched the gear train, each tooth labeled with measurements taken by candlelight in the granary. She used a dollar store magnifying glass and a pencil stub to document every imperfection, every point of wear. She'd calculated the exact amount of play in the bearings, 0.03 inches, and machined shims from discarded copper pipe to take up the slack. Weber ran his finger down her notes, his expression shifting from skepticism to awe. You did this with what? A hand, file, and hope. She met his gaze, her pale blue eyes steady. $84.85. Total. The vise $8, the fryer tools $22, coal for the first winter $14, welding rod $3.40. Total $84.85. She didn't mention the nights she'd sat in the granary after midnight, wondering if she was throwing her life away on dead iron. She didn't need to. Weber saw it in the calluses on her hands. He stepped back and surveyed the single restored loom, then the 12 others still shrouded in tarps in the granary shadows. His voice dropped, not in secrecy but in reverence. There is a consortium. Museums in Berlin, Lyon, Boston. They want these machines restored to working order, not for display behind glass, for demonstration, for education, for the sound of history breathing again. He named a figure, $1,200 per loom. For all 1,400, Alina didn't flinch. She didn't do the math out loud. She just looked at the loom, still warm from its test run, the newly woven cloth hanging like a flag. Then she said the only words she needed. Only if all 1,400 run perfectly. Not one seized bearing. Not one cracked casting. Not one gear out of tolerance. Weber blinked. You would demand that? She closed her notebook with a snap. I restored one. You want 1,400. Prove they are worth what you say. The silence stretched. Outside, a crow cawed. Inside, the loom's flywheel ticked as it cooled. Weber took off his gloves and placed them on the workbench. He looked at Alina, the auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot, the light scattering across her wire-rimmed glasses, the military straight posture that never bent even when the world laughed. He saw the daughter of a machinist who taught her that numbers don't lie, but they do hide. He saw the woman who'd read a 1984 lease clause nobody else had noticed. He saw the engineer who'd rebuilt history with $84.85. He nodded. We will test each machine, one by one. If it fails, it stays here. If it passes, it travels. He extended his hand. Alina took it. No handshake lasted longer in Mill Creek that year. Weber pulled a contract from his satchel, thick with clauses in 3 languages. He pointed to a line about phased payments, $200,000 up front, the rest upon completion of each 100 looms. Alina scanned it, her finger tracing the figures, then stopped at a clause about shipping insurance. She pulled her notebook open to a fresh page and wrote 2 words, use the red shed. She showed it to Weber. He frowned. I do not understand. She tapped the words. My father said I could use the red shed, not a warehouse, not a museum annex. The red shed, it has electricity, it has space. It has history of its own. Weber studied her. You would keep them here? She looked past him through the granary door to where the other looms stood like silent sentinels in the cornfield. They came here broken. They'll leave whole, but they'll leave from here. He smiled then, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Very well, the red shed. He initialed the change. Then he did something unexpected. He took out a fountain pen, silver, expensive, and wrote a personal check for $20,000. Cash against the first 100. Alina didn't pocket it. She placed it carefully in her notebook beside the itemized cost list that had won her father's permission. $84.85. Now $20,000. The arithmetic held. The world had paid to get rid of this iron. Now it was paying to bring it back. As Weber packed his journals, he paused at the doorway. He turned back, his overcoat dusted with Iowa soil. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It crushed them. It left fields fallow and families broken. He gestured at the looms. This cost nothing but time and knowledge. It cannot be taken away. Eleanor stood in the center of her granary, the smell of hot metal and coal oil in the air, and watched the Volkswagen Beetle disappear down the gravel road. She walked to the restored loom and ran her hand over the smooth casting. The brass pocket watch her father had given her, his own father's watch, ticked against her ribs. She opened her notebook to a blank page. At the top, she wrote in neat block letters, Phase 1, 100 looms. Below it, she began a new itemized list. The vise, $8. The fryer tools, $22. Coal for the winter. She didn't write the total yet. She didn't need to, she knew it by heart. $84.85. And then some. His offer of $1,200 per loom for the entire restored lot. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1, context bridge, 1E slot 2, section transition, 4B slot 3, final reflection, 8G slot 4, opening turn, 9H. And then some. His offer of $1,200 per loom for the entire restored lot. Eleanor Vance signed the contract with Dr. Klaus Weber that very afternoon in the red shed, her wire-rimmed glasses catching the dust motes dancing in the late October sun. Let me tell you about those contract terms, because you need to understand the risk before you can understand the drought. $850 per loom, not the $1,200 he'd offered initially. A working condition guarantee etched in small print. Every Hawthorne iron loom model T14 had to weave a perfect swatch under factory specifications, or the payment dropped to scrap value. She'd negotiated that clause herself, her auburn hair pulled back tight, the small leather-bound notebook opened to page 17, where she'd calculated the metallurgical tolerances down to the thousandth of an inch. Most people see a rusted loom frame, and they see dead weight. Robert Vance saw a cast-iron skeleton that could outlive empires. And he was right. She hired 3 local welders by Thanksgiving, men who'd been laid off from the John Deere plant when the farm crisis hit. Walter Pritchard, whose hands still smelled of machine oil even after 6 months idle. Ben Carter, who'd welded grain bins for 20 years before the co-op downsized. And young Danny Riley, barely 22, with burns across his knuckles from his first arc torch at 16. They worked in the Granaries chill, their breath fogging the air as they reinforced cracked frames with fresh steel. Eleanor paid them $8 an hour from the advance Weber wired, watching their skepticism melt into grudging respect when she explained why the loom's flywheel needed precise harmonic balancing. No arguments, just the hiss of welding rods and the clang of hammers shaping iron back to purpose. She kept receipts in that same notebook, every dollar accounted for. Welding rod, $3.40. Safety goggles, $7. Coal for the forge, $14 even. Total, $84.85. Less than 1/10 of what a single dealer part would have cost. By January 1988, operations scaled to 3 granaries. The red shed held the disassembly line, where gears were brushed free of decades of rust. The old co-op warehouse became the calibration space, its concrete floors marked with chalk lines for gear alignment. And the vacant grain elevator, leased for $1 a year after the owner walked away, housed the final assembly bays. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The looms clanked back to life, one gear at a time, their brass fittings gleaming under kerosene lamps. Eleanor's father Robert would visit at dusk, his silver-gray hair pulled back in a low bun, brass pocket watch ticking against his corduroy vest as he checked tension measurements. That didn't last. And then Harlan Briggs walked into the Mill Creek feed store on a Tuesday morning in June of 1988, his navy blue work shirt soaked through with sweat, and said, "I ain't seen a sky this dry since the 30s. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing, not the cruel chuckle of a man who'd once called her loom project a damn fool's hobby, but the hollow sound of a co-op manager realizing his life's work was turning to dust. He wiped his brow with a red plaid vest, gold wedding band glinting, and turned to the room. 60 days without rain. Corns curling like burnt paper. The drought had begun, not a slow creep but a hammer blow. The earth cracked open in fissures deep enough to swallow a man's boot, and the wind carried topsoil from fields that hadn't seen a blade of grass in weeks. You know what zero rainfall for 60 days did to crop operations in Harlan County? It turned insurance claims into ghost stories. Farmers lined up at the co-op office with withered stalks in burlap sacks, receipts for seed and fertilizer trembling in their hands. Harlan Briggs, who'd once laughed at Aliner's Looms, now sat behind his desk signing forms with a fountain pen that scratched across the paper like a dying animal. The insurance adjuster from Des Moines never showed. Paperwork vanished into filing cabinets, promises evaporated like the morning dew that never came. One afternoon, Aliner watched old man Peterson shuffle out of the co-op, his overalls stained with dirt and tears, muttering about 18% interest killing us twice. The bank would foreclose before the check cleared. Meanwhile, in the granaries, the loom restoration continued. Welders hammered through the heat, their shirts dark with sweat but their work steady. Danny Riley burned his forearm on a red-hot bracket but wrapped it in a rag and kept shaping steel. Aliner moved between sites with her notebook, checking gear teeth for wear, her pale blue eyes scanning for imperfections invisible to anyone else. She didn't gloat, didn't say, "I told you so," to the doubters. Anxiety lived in her chest like a stone. What if a loom failed Weber's test? What if the drought outlasted their cash reserves? One night she sat alone in the red shed, the kerosene lamp casting long shadows, and almost closed the notebook for good. The numbers blurred. $850 per loom, 1,400 looms, a fortune if it worked, a ruin if it didn't. She traced her father's old rulebook entry, "Iron doesn't lie. It either holds or it breaks." She didn't sleep, just watched the rust flakes drift down like red snow. Robert Vance found her there at dawn, her wire-rimmed glasses smudged, the notebook open to a page of calculations. He said nothing, just placed a chipped mug of coffee beside her and ran a callous thumb over a gear assembly. Then, as the first pale light hit the granary doors, he spoke the words that anchored her. No water needed for iron. 3 words. No ceremony. Just the quiet certainty of a man who rebuilt engines in dust storms. He wasn't praising her, wasn't even looking at her. His gray eyes stayed fixed on the loom frame, brass pocket watch glinting as he adjusted a tension bolt. But in that moment, the anxiety cracked like dry earth. The work was the point. The iron would hold. Outside, the drought tightened its grip. Fields that should have been knee-high in corn stood barren, the stalks brittle as old bones. Insurance adjusters' cars kicked up clouds of dust on empty roads, but the checks never came. Harlan Briggs stopped laughing altogether. He'd sit on the co-op steps at noon, staring at the bleached sky, his red plaid vest unbuttoned, silver fountain pen idle in his vest pocket. The co-op's feed sales dropped to nothing, no grain to supplement starving cattle. Yet in the granaries, hammers rang out like church bells. Welders bent steel under kerosene lamps while the world outside turned to powder. Aliner's notebook filled with new entries, labor costs, material yields, the exact moment a Looms shuttle first flew true. She never mentioned the drought, didn't need to. The proof was in the rhythm of hammers on iron, in the smell of hot metal cutting through the scent of dying crops. Let me tell you about that notebook, because you need to understand the arithmetic before you can understand the survival. Page 42, loom number 371. Frame reinforcement complete, tested at full tension. Swatch width, 42 inches, flaw count, 0. Page 43, payment received from Weber, $317,500. No exclamation points, no triumph, just the facts marching forward like soldiers. While neighbors mortgaged their homes for seed they couldn't plant, Aliner's ledgers showed steady black ink. The looms didn't care about rain, didn't need irrigation ditches or government subsidies. They ran on coal and skill, their cast iron bones indifferent to the sky's cruelty. You know what a drought does to pride. It strips it bare. Harlan Briggs stopped meeting her eyes at the post office. His co-op manager's chair sat empty for hours, the keys to the warehouse gathering dust on his desk. But the work continued. 3 granaries hummed now with the sound of rebirth, gears meshing, shuttles flying, iron singing under the strain of purpose. Danny Riley welded a cracked flywheel for loom 812, his hands steady despite the heat shimmering off the metal. Ben Carter calibrated tension rods by eye, the way he'd learned on grain bins 20 years prior. And Walter Pritchard, who'd almost refused the job, now brought his grandsons to watch the looms breathe again. They stood in the doorway of the grain elevator, small hands sticky with candy, staring at the resurrected machines like they were dragons in a storybook. Alina walked the sites every evening as the sun bled into the horizon. Her denim jacket was streaked with soot, her boots scuffed beyond recognition, but her posture stayed military straight. She'd pause at a loom, adjust a belt, then move on. No speeches, no reminders of who'd been right, just the work. The only sound besides the machinery was Robert Vance's voice, low and steady, as he showed Danny how to true a warped shaft. Heat it slow. Let the metal tell you when it's ready. In the red shed, the brass key on the steel ring of her notebook caught the last light, a small, stubborn gleam in the gathering dark. Corn stalks withering in fields while loom restoration continues. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1, context bridge, 1E slot 2 section transition, 4B slot 3 final reflection, 8G slot 4 opening turn, 9H. The dust hung thick in the granary air, each particle catching the weak afternoon sun as Alina turned the crank on the third restored loom. The machine hummed, a sound like distant thunder, pulling raw flax into something strong and useful. And then Harlan Briggs stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. His navy blue work shirt clung to his broad shoulders with sweat, the red plaid vest unbuttoned to reveal a damp white undershirt, and that silver fountain pen he always kept clipped to his vest pocket was gone. He looked 10 years older than the last time she'd seen him at the feed store, when he'd laughed at her plan to salvage the Hawthorne looms. Now his hands hung empty at his sides, and his eyes kept darting to the loom as if it might bite him. Alina's auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her wire-rimmed glasses smudged with oil, the faded blue denim jacket she wore every day streaked with rust. She didn't look up from the shuttle mechanism, her fingers adjusting the tension on the warp threads with the precision of a watchmaker. The small leather-bound notebook lay open on a crate nearby, its pages filled with her neat script, gear ratios, flax yields, coal consumption figures. Let me tell you about Harlan Briggs, because you need to understand what a co-op manager carries before you can understand why he stood there trembling. He had 19 years behind that counter, 19 years of knowing every farmer's crop yield down to the bushel, every loan payment date etched in his memory, every whispered worry about the bank manager's mood. He knew the weight of a handshake and the cost of a broken promise. And now, the drought had turned his world to dust. The corn fields around Mill Creek were brown and brittle, the stalks withered to nothing in the fields she'd driven past that morning. The co-op's books were bleeding red ink, and the bank was circling like a buzzard. Foreclosure papers sat on his desk, unsigned but inevitable, the interest charges piling up like cordwood. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The spring rains had come on time, and the corn had pushed through the soil green and hopeful, knee-high by the 4th of July, just like the old saying. That didn't last. By June, the sky was a hard blue dome with no cloud in sight for 60 days straight. The earth cracked open like old pottery, deep fissures swallowing seedlings whole. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s. It left them with nothing when the drought came. Men who'd taken out loans for new combines and irrigation systems found themselves owing $200,000 on land worth half that. The bank called in the notes, and there was no crop to sell, no margin to breathe. Harlan's co-op was supposed to be the lifeline, but with no grain to move, there was no revenue to cover the debt. He'd watched 3 farmers pack their trucks last week, heading west with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you stood in a room with someone who'd laughed at your dreams and asked for their help? When was the last time pride had to choke down dust just to survive? Answer it, then return to the story. Alina wiped her hands on her denim jacket, the frayed cuffs she'd worn for 3 years straight. She didn't say a word. She just waited, her pale blue eyes steady behind the smudged lenses. Harlan cleared his throat, a dry sound like gravel in a tin can. He stepped inside, his polished brown brogues leaving tracks in the sawdust. "Heard you got one of these things running," he said, nodding at the loom. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "Thought I'd see for myself." He moved closer, his strong jaw working as he studied the cast iron frame. His calloused fingers traced the gear housing, feeling for the telltale pitting of rust or the wobble of a misaligned shaft. There was none. The metal was smooth where it should be, the tolerances tight as a drum. He knew metal, he'd grown up around farm machinery, but this was different. This was precision engineering, the kind that didn't belong in a granary in Harlan County. Most people see a rusted hulk of iron and they see scrap. Robert Vance saw potential. He'd been the same way with engine blocks back in his machine shop days, always seeing the shape beneath the rust, the grained structure that could be reborn. Alina had learned that from him, the way he'd taught her to read the stress lines in a casting or the flex in a timber beam. She reached for the crank and gave it a slow turn. The loom came alive, the shuttle flying back and forth with a rhythmic clack, weaving a strip of linen as fine as anything from a factory. The warp threads held steady under tension. She'd calibrated herself, the weft threads interlacing perfectly. No snags, no breaks, just pure, unbroken motion. Harlan watched, his deep brown eyes narrowed. He bent closer, his heavy brows drawn together. "This is the same model," he muttered. "The Hawthorne T14. Thought they were all junked after the mills closed." He ran a thumb over the serial number plate, worn but still legible. Built in the 1920s. Cast iron frame, bronze bushings, damn near indestructible if you keep the oil flowing. He straightened up, his gaze falling on the small desk in the corner. On it lay a thick document, the kind with legal letterhead and a ribbon seal. He picked it up, his fingers leaving smudges on the paper. Alina didn't stop him. She watched as he read, his eyes scanning the lines, his throat working as he took in the numbers. $1,200,000. For the entire lot of 1,400 looms, signed by Dr. Klaus Weber of the European Textile Heritage Consortium, dated last Tuesday. The silence stretched, broken only by the loom's steady clack. Harlan lowered the contract, his face pale beneath the freckles on his nose. He looked at Alina, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the woman who'd been called a fool for dragging scrap iron out of a field, who'd sat through his laughter at the feed store when she'd asked about the loom's scrap value. He saw the wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, the pale blue eyes that never flinched, the military straight posture even after hours of labor. He saw the small leather-bound notebook lying open on the desk, filled with her precise handwriting, cost analyses showing $8.85 for the first loom's restoration, gear ratios calculated to within 1,000th of an inch, timelines for phased shipping to Germany. He saw the woman who'd been 17 years old when she'd found that 1984 lease clause reverting abandoned equipment to the landowner, who'd spent 2 years teaching herself textile engineering from library manuals while everyone else called it a hobby. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words. His voice cracked on the last syllable. You could see the tension in his throat, the way his Adam's apple bobbed as he forced the words out. It cost him something, his pride, his certainty, the unshakable belief that he knew what was possible in Harlan County. He stood there, the co-op manager with 19 years of experience, admitting he'd been blind. His single dimple on the left cheek didn't move. Then he did something practical. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a set of keys. "The co-op warehouse," he said. "It's empty now, no grain to store. You can have it, for the looms, until you need them shipped." He placed the keys on the desk next to the contract. They landed with a soft clink, the steel ring holding 5 keys, 2 for the main doors, 1 for the office, 1 for the electrical panel, 1 spare. No rent, not while the drought's on. Robert Vance chose that moment to step into the granary. He'd been listening from the doorway, his stocky frame filling the space, his silver-gray hair pulled back in its usual low bun. He held his brass pocket watch in one palm, the chain dangling, the faint birthmark on his left jaw standing out against his light olive skin. He didn't look at Harlan. He walked straight to the ledger on Alina's desk, the one with the blue cover and the neatly kept columns. He ran his finger down a line of figures, the cost of coal for the winter, $14, the fryer tools for the flax preparation, $22, the welding rod for gear repairs, $3.40, the vise for alignment, $8. Total, $84.85 for the first loom. Then he looked at the revenue column, $120 for the first bolt of linen sold to a local quilter. He flipped to the next page, showing the phased payments from Weber's contract, $200,000 on signing, $400,000 on delivery of the first 500 looms, the balance upon museum installation. "You were right," he said. 2 words, quiet and final, no ceremony, no fanfare, just the simple acknowledgement that had cost him nothing because he'd only ever been waiting for proof. He closed the ledger and tucked his pocket watch back into his vest. The brass key on the steel ring of Aliner's notebook caught the last light, a small, stubborn gleam in the gathering dark. Harlan nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. He turned and walked out without another word, the door creaking shut behind him. The sound of his brogues faded across the gravel. Aliner stood there, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam. She picked up the keys, cold and heavy in her hand. She thought of the red shed, the rusted hulks waiting in the field, the years of work ahead. But also the years behind, the library trips to Des Moines for interlibrary loans, the nights hunched over a Singer engineering manual by kerosene light, the seized gear assembly that had taken Walter Pritchard's custom puller to free, the nights when quitting seemed like the only sane choice. Robert placed a hand on her shoulder, his work-roughened palm warm through the denim. "You'll need more space," he said. "Start moving them tomorrow." She nodded. The looms would live. They always had. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1, context bridge. 1E slot 2, section transition. 4B slot 3, final reflection. 8G slot 4, opening turn. 9H. How does someone turn 12 tons of rust into 12 jobs when the whole county called it scrap? The answer started with Harlan Briggs standing in Aliner Vance's driveway at dawn. The red plaid vest he always wore pulled tight over his chest. Keys to the Mill Creek Co-op warehouse jingling in his palm. His silver fountain pen wasn't clipped to his vest pocket that morning. It was tucked away, like he knew he wouldn't need to write anything down. He just handed her the steel ring, the keys cold from the October air, and said, "I was wrong." 3 words. Then he walked back to his pickup without looking at the looms stacked like fallen giants in her field. Aliner Vance, 28 years old, fair pink skin flushed from the wind, wire-rimmed glasses smudged with dust, didn't say thank you. She just nodded once, her leather-bound notebook already open to a fresh page, pencil hovering. The brass key on the steel ring felt heavy. Real, she'd need it. The warehouse smelled of concrete dust and old grain sacks when she first pushed through the side door. 250 feet long, 70 feet wide, with high ceilings that swallowed sound. Empty except for a few pallets of fertilizer bags Harlan hadn't moved yet. Sunlight cut through grimy skylights, illuminating motes dancing above the cracked concrete floor. Aliner walked the length twice, her scuffed brown work boots echoing. She stopped where the light hit a patch of dampness near the north wall. Humidity was the enemy. Cast iron warped if you didn't control the air. She knew the annealing temperatures for cast iron from that battered Singer manual she'd pulled from the library shelves months before, the one Harlan had laughed at. 572 degrees Fahrenheit for stress relief. But you couldn't hit that number without stable humidity first. She pulled her notebook free from the back pocket of her worn jeans, the yellow cotton t-shirt underneath already sticking to her skin. Sketches filled the pages, ventilation ducts, dehumidifier placements, work bays drawn in precise lines. Robert Vance, her father, had taught her that a plan without numbers was just daydreaming. So she wrote them down. The dehumidifiers, $2,000 each. The ductwork, $830. The insulation, $1,170. She totaled it right there on the warehouse floor, $4,000 even. Less than half what Harlan had quoted for a single new dealer part back when he thought she was crazy. She smiled faintly. Her father's voice in her head, most people see rust and they see junk. Robert Vance saw potential. He saw a problem waiting for a solution. For a while, the humidity stayed below 40%. That didn't last. The first real test came in February 1989. A thaw turned the fields to soup, and moisture seeped under the warehouse doors. Aliner found condensation beating on the loom frames at dawn. She didn't panic. She called Walter Pritchard, the machine shop owner who'd given her that custom puller when the gear seized. Walter arrived with 2 guys from the feed store, all of them in Carhartt jackets, no questions asked. They laid sandbags along the threshold, jury-rigged a sump pump from the co-op's spare parts, and got the dehumidifiers humming again by noon. Aliner watched them work, her auburn hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, the faint freckles across her nose standing out against her pale skin. She didn't say much, just handed Walter a thermos of coffee and noted the labor hours in her ledger later. That ledger-thick green cloth cover, pages filled with Robert's precise copperplate, lived on her workbench now. He de-started it the day he signed the permission slip for the red shed. Every penny tracked. The vise, $8. The fryer tools, $22. Coal for the first winter, $14. Welding rod, $3.40. Total, $84.85. Now it held bigger numbers, but the principle was the same. Material cost versus dealer value. Always. The revenue started small, $50,000 in 1989, just enough to cover the warehouse lease and pay Walter and his crew part-time. $120,000 in 1990, then $310,000 by 1993. Each number landed in Robert's ledger like a stone dropped in still water. Alina never celebrated. She just turned the page and wrote the next figure. She de-learned from the first failed gear assembly how a seized bearing taught her about phosphoric acid rust conversion. Now she taught others. Local kids fresh out of high school, farmers between seasons, even Doris Hagen from the post office who'd always tinkered with engines. They gathered in the warehouse on Saturday mornings, Alina standing before a chalkboard salvaged from the old schoolhouse. She'd draw the grain structure of cast iron under magnification, explain how micrometer readings to the thousandths of an inch kept a loom running true. No fluff, no jargon, just the science. Doris learned metallurgy faster than anyone. Her hands, rough from sorting mail, moved with surprising delicacy over a caliper. By 1994, Doris was measuring tolerance rings for the European buyers. 12 full-time jobs now, all paying better than the co-op. Harlan Briggs stopped by sometimes, not to doubt anymore, but to watch. He'd lean against his pickup in that red plaid vest, hands in his pockets, saying nothing, just watching Doris's hands move. He'd seen her as the quiet woman behind the counter. Now he saw the engineer. Robert Vance visited every Tuesday. He'd walk the warehouse floor in his cream cable-knit sweater, brown corduroy trousers, the brass pocket watch he always carried held loosely in his palm. He never touched the looms, just observed, took notes in a small leather book that matched Alina's. His posture was slightly stooped now, the weight of 60 years in a machine shop settling into his shoulders. But his eyes, gray and sharp behind silver-rimmed glasses, missed nothing. One Tuesday, he found Alina hunched over a ledger, her wire-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose, the pale blue eyes narrowed in concentration. The revenue column for 1994 was filled. She was staring at the expense side. Something wasn't balancing. Robert didn't speak. He just pulled out his own book, flipped to a page near the back, and tapped a figure with his finger. Alina leaned in. It was the coal cost from the first winter, $14. But Robert had written it as $14.02. She'd rounded it in her ledger, a difference of 2 cents. Her cheeks flushed. She'd been so focused on the big numbers she'd gotten sloppy with the small ones. Robert said nothing, just closed his book with a soft thud. The message was clear: precision matters, always. Alina fixed the ledger that afternoon. 2 cents, but it was the principle. The thing that was paid for, the 2 cents, the time, the attention, was the only thing that couldn't be taken away. The warehouse hummed with a new rhythm now. Dehumidifiers hissed steadily in the background. Grinders whined as Doris and the others smoothed cast-iron seams. The smell of hot metal and machine oil hung in the air, mixed with the faint tang of the phosphoric acid baths. Alina stood at the center of it, her faded blue denim jacket unzipped, the small leather-bound notebook always in hand. She watched Doris fit a newly restored gear assembly into loom number 7. Doris wiped her hands on a rag, stepped back, and nodded. Alina pulled the lever. The loom shuddered, then caught. Belts turned. Shuttles flew. Perfect rhythm. No seized bearings, no warped frames. Just clean, functional machinery doing exactly what it was built to do. Alina didn't cheer. She just made a note in her book: Loom 7 operational. Material cost, $187.30. Dealer value, $3,900. Profit margin, 95.2%. She closed the book, looked around at the 12 people working, their faces lit by the glow of work lamps. This was the real proof, not the money, the people, the skills, the thing they'd built from what everyone else threw away. By 1995, the ledger showed $500,000 in annual revenue. $500,000, a number that would have made Harlan Briggs laugh himself sick back in '87. Now it sat in Robert's green cloth book, written in his careful hand. Alina traced the figure with her finger, the paper rough under her touch. She thought about that Tuesday morning behind the machine shop, the cracked engine block, the laughter, how the world writes things off so fast. She looked up. Her father stood in the warehouse doorway, the late afternoon sun haloing his silver-gray hair pulled back in its low bun. He held out his pocket watch, the brass warm from his palm, not to check the time, just to show her. The gesture meant everything. You were right. He didn't need to say it. The numbers said it. The jobs said it. The looms, standing tall and clean in their climate-controlled bays, said it. Robert Vance turned and walked back toward his truck, the slight stoop in his shoulders the only sign of the years. Eleanor watched him go. Then she opened her notebook again. There was always another gear to measure, another tolerance to check. The work never ended. It just grew. She planted a future in a rusted field. They called it scrap. The drought came. The corn failed. The looms lived. Robert's callous thumb, tracing the ledger numbers one last time, felt the weight of what they'd saved. Counterclockwise arrows, button rotation, log, slot 1, context, bridge. 1E, slot 2, section, transition. 4B, slot 3, final, reflection. 8G, slot 4, opening, turn. 9H. On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Emmett Vandermeer stood in the gravel lot behind his machine shop in Harlan County, Iowa, and watched a 17-year-old boy drag a cracked engine block out of his scrap pile without asking permission. The looms lived. Robert's callous thumb, tracing the ledger numbers one last time, felt the weight of what they'd saved. How does someone go from salvaging rusted iron in a drought to commanding respect in European textile circles? Let me tell you about Eleanor Vance's hands, because you need to understand what happens when calluses meet chemistry before you can understand why Berlin came calling. Most people see rust, and they see decay. Robert Vance saw potential locked in iron oxide, and he'd taught his daughter to see it too. Eleanor stood in the red shed's cool dimness, wire-rimmed glasses smudged with tannic acid, her auburn hair pulled back tight against the Iowa wind howling through the granary cracks. She dipped a cotton swab into her third failed solution, too acidic, ate right through the patina, and touched it to the Hawthorne loom's flywheel. The metal hissed. She sighed, the sound lost in the granary's groan. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The 1988 drought had broken, corn prices crept upward, and Harlan Briggs brought warehouse keys without a word. That didn't last. Rust never sleeps. Eleanor flipped open Robert's journal, its pages brittle with age and stained with coffee rings. His precise machinist script detailed gear tolerances down to the thousandth of an inch. She'd spent 2 years chasing museum conservators for secrets, only to find their methods too harsh for iron this old. Her solution had to be gentle as a whisper. She mixed distilled water with tannic acid powder, measuring by the gram on a scale Robert had bought at a farm auction for $3.40. Too little acid, the rust kept spreading like a cancer. Too much, and the metal turned to powder. On the 17th attempt, she added a pinch of sodium benzoate, food preservative from the co-op, and watched the rust transform. Where the swab touched, the orange flake turned deep blue-black, stable, sealed. She held her breath. The granary air smelled of vinegar and hope. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you fixed something by understanding why it broke instead of just covering the crack? Eleanor knew iron's memory. She'd pored over a discarded Singer engineering manual from 1952, its spine cracked, pages yellowed. The Hawthorne Model T14 wasn't scrap. It was precision-cast iron, stress-tested for decades of shuttle impacts. Its flaws were surface deep. Her stabilization process cost $12 for the tannic acid, $3.20 for the distilled water, and $1.15 for the sodium benzoate. Total, $16.35 per loom. She wrote it in her small leather-bound notebook, the same one she'd carried since 1987. Then she did the unthinkable. She published it, not in some trade rag, but in the Industrial Preservation Quarterly. Sent her findings typed on a manual Smith Corona, diagrams drawn with Robert's old drafting compass. The journal arrived in Harlan County 6 weeks later, tucked between seed catalogs at the post office. There it was, Non-Invasive Rust Stabilization for Cast Iron Textile Looms by Eleanor Vance of Mill Creek, Iowa. She ran her finger over her name, the ink slightly smudged. Robert found her staring at it, his brass pocket watch ticking against his corduroy vest. He didn't say a word, just nodded, slow and deep, like a tree bending in the wind. That journal article became her apprentice's Bible. 3 young women from the community college started showing up at the red shed on Saturdays, notebooks clutched like shields. Alina taught them Robert's way: measure twice, cut once, never trust a shiny surface. She handed them his journals, the pages soft from decades of use. See this notation, she'd say, her pale blue eyes sharp behind wire rims. He's not just marking gear wear, he's mapping the metal's fatigue. One apprentice, a quiet girl named Marnie, caught a casting flaw the others missed: a hairline crack in a tension arm. Alina showed her how to reinforce it with a forged steel sleeve, salvaged from a broken plow point. The cost? $0. The value? A loom that would run another 50 years. Robert's journals became their compass, his coffee stains like landmarks on a map. Then came the Midwest Business Magazine feature. A reporter named Carl showed up in a rented sedan, shiny shoes sinking into the red shed's dirt floor. He'd expected a hobbyist, found an empire. $500,000 in annual revenue, he said, pen hovering over his pad. From rust. Alina didn't flinch. She walked him to the warehouse Harlan Briggs had handed over during the drought. Sunlight cut through high windows, illuminating 17 restored Hawthorne looms, their iron gleaming under protective wax. Each one cost $84.85 to restore, she said, her voice flat as a ruler. They sell for $1,200. We've sold $1,400. Carl's pen stopped moving. He'd come for a human interest fluff piece. He left with front-page copy. The article ran with a photo of Alina, denim jacket sleeves rolled, hands resting on a loom's frame. Her freckled nose was smudged with grease. The caption read, "The Iron Alchemist of Iowa." The Berlin invitation arrived on thick cream paper, embossed with the Textile Museum seal. Dr. Klaus Weber, the same man who'd offered $1,200 per loom back in 1995, now wanted Alina to speak at their material reclamation symposium. He'd tracked her down through the journal article. "Your methods," his letter said, "are changing how we preserve industrial heritage." But the offers came too that week. A New York collector wanted to buy the entire operation for $7 million. A German conglomerate offered $10 million, all cash, no strings. Their representatives wore suits that cost more than Alina's pickup truck. One man, slick-haired with cufflinks that caught the light, leaned across her kitchen table. "Be realistic, Mrs. Vance," he said, tapping a contract. "This is a museum piece now. You've done your bit. Let professionals handle it." Alina pushed the papers back. "I am the professional," she said. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing, not cruel, but the dry chuckle of a man who's bought bigger things than pride. She didn't argue, just stood, her military straight posture making the small kitchen feel smaller. "I'm not selling." He left the contract on the table. She used it to light the stove that night. The real work continued. Alina refined her stabilization process, cutting costs further. She switched to rainwater collection for the distilled water, saving $3.20. She negotiated bulk tannic acid from a tannery in St. Louis, bringing the cost down to $10. Every penny saved meant another loom rescued, another apprentice trained. She kept Robert's ledger open on the workbench, its pages filled with tiny, precise entries. One Tuesday, Marnie caught her staring at a page dated October 19, 1987, the day she'd laid her itemized cost sheet on Robert's kitchen table. $84.85. Total. Alina traced the numbers with a fingertip, the paper rough under her callous skin. She remembered Robert's voice, gravelly with doubt. "I need to think about it." She remembered the 3 days of silence that followed. Now, the ledger showed $500,000. But the number that mattered was 17, the apprentices she'd trained, each with their own notebook, their own way of seeing. You know what happens when corporate money meets quiet determination. The New York collector sent a second offer, this time with threats. "Your little operation isn't scalable," his lawyer wrote. "Without investment, it's just a hobby." Alina mailed back the contract with "not for sale" written across it in Robert's old fountain pen. She didn't keep a copy. She didn't need to. The red shed held all the proof she required: the smell of beeswax polish, the rhythmic clack of looms running tests, the sound of apprentices debating gear tolerances. One evening, Harlan Briggs stopped by with a thermos of coffee. He didn't mention the buyout offers, just stood beside her, watching Marnie adjust a shuttle. "You were right," he said, the words rough like unpolished iron. Then he handed her a set of keys, new warehouse space downtown. No ceremony, just keys. The Berlin invitation sat on Alina's desk for 3 days. She turned it over in her hands, the paper smooth and expensive. She thought about Robert, bent over his journals in this same granary. She thought about the apprentices, their notebooks filling with equations and sketches. She thought about the looms themselves, silent witnesses to decades of doubt and determination. Pride wasn't a shout. It was the weight of the brass pocket watch she now carried in her own vest pocket, Robert's gift when he retired. It was the coffee stain on page 47 of his journal, where he'd spilled his morning cup while calculating load paths. It was the way Marnie's hands now moved with the same sureness as hers. Alina picked up her pen. She didn't write a speech. She wrote acceptance. One sentence. I'll be there. Then she opened her small leather-bound notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, Clara's idea, digital scanning for archival preservation. Below it she sketched a rough diagram, the future already taking shape. She planted a future in a rusted field. They called it a hobby. The drought came. The corn failed. The looms lived. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1, context bridge. 1E slot 2, section transition. 4B slot 3, final reflection. 8G slot 4, opening turn. 9H. On a Tuesday morning in October of 2024, Alina Vance stood at a polished oak lectern in a Berlin auditorium, her wire-rimmed glasses catching the stage lights as she adjusted the leather-bound notebook in her hands. The scent of aged paper and dust from the Hawthorne Iron Looms archives still clung to her faded blue denim jacket. Let me tell you about cast iron, because you need to understand how grain structure holds memory before you can understand why a machine built in 1923 still whispers to someone who knows how to listen. Most people see rust, and they see decay. Her father Robert saw molecular alignment in the carbon matrix, the way tensile strength could outlive empires if you treated it right. The silence in the room stretched thin as she looked out at textile historians and museum directors, their faces sharp with expectation. She planted her palms flat on the lectern, the freckles across her nose standing out against skin weathered by 37 years of Iowa sun. Scrap is just material waiting for understanding, she said, her voice steady as a lathe. It's never the thing that's broken. It's the eyes looking at it. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you held an object that carried someone else's hands in it? Not just fingerprints, but the pressure of their decisions, the weight of their patience. Answer that, then come back to Berlin. Alina turned a page in her notebook, the paper crackling like dry corn stalks. She described the looms not as relics, but as conversations across time, the way the flywheel's mass conserved energy, how the shuttle race geometry defied wear through harmonic balance. She spoke of phosphorus content in the castings, how it stabilized the metal against thermal shock. The audience leaned forward as she explained the refractory lining in the original foundry molds, how it allowed precise cooling rates that modern factories had abandoned for speed. Let me tell you about phosphorus, because you need to understand metallurgical patience before you can understand why a farmer's daughter spent years scraping rust off scrap piles. She walked them through the exact moment in 1988 when the first loom wove a swatch of linen under drought conditions that had withered cornfields to dust. $11.40 in materials against a $390 dealer part. The arithmetic held. The room held its breath. Then the young woman in the back row stood up. Clara Vance, 28 years old, shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back like her mother's, the same pale blue eyes behind thinner-framed glasses. She carried a tablet under one arm and a leather notebook identical to Alina's, its cover worn smooth at the edges. And then Clara raised her hand, not for a question but for an offering. The moderator nodded, confused, as she walked forward, boots clicking on the hardwood floor. Clara placed her notebook beside Alina's on the lectern. Inside, sketches bled into digital renderings, 3D scans of loom gears overlaid with stress simulations, thermal imaging showing heat distribution in real time. She flipped to a page where a holographic projection shimmered above the paper, revealing microscopic fractures invisible to the naked eye. Let me tell you about light, because you need to understand how photons map history before you can understand what Clara saw in those shadows. Most people see a gear and they see a gear. Clara saw the ghost of every thread it had ever woven, the fatigue lines singing of decades under tension. Alina didn't speak. She just watched her daughter's hands, slim like Robert's but quicker, tracing vectors on the tablet screen with a stylus. Clara explained how photogrammetry could capture the loom's entire geometry in minutes, how algorithms could predict wear patterns before they became failures. She spoke of cloud-stored preservation logs, real-time monitoring of humidity in the restoration barns back in Mill Creek. The audience murmured as Clara described overlaying archival blueprints with live sensor data, creating a living archive. Let me tell you about time, because you need to understand how seconds accumulate before you can understand why this mattered. She pointed to a simulation where a virtual loom strained under load, then showed the exact stress point where the real machine had cracked in 1989. The fix had taken Alina 3 weeks of trial and error. Clara's model predicted it in 17 seconds. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The corn had failed. The looms lived. That didn't last. The drought of 1988 was just the first test. Then came the interest rate spikes, the foreclosure wave that swept across the plains like a prairie fire. But the looms survived because they'd never borrowed money to expand. They'd been paid for in sweat and scavenged parts. Let me tell you about risk, because you need to understand what you don't owe before you can understand freedom. Clara's voice cut through the nostalgia. This isn't about preserving the past, she said. It's about teaching the past to speak the future's language. She tapped her tablet, and the hologram shifted to show a loom weaving with carbon fiber thread, its movements adjusted by AI to prevent stress fractures. The audience erupted. Not polite applause, but a standing ovation, historians and curators on their feet, hands stinging from clapping. Alina felt the vibration through the floorboards. Clara leaned close, her breath warm against Alina's ear. I ran the numbers, Mama. The scanner pays for itself in 6 months by preventing downtime. She opened her notebook to a page filled with itemized costs. The tablet, $320. The scanning software subscription, $78 yearly. The protective case, $12.50. Total, $410.50. Alina didn't ask where Clara had gotten the idea. She saw the same hunger in her daughter's eyes that she'd carried to Robert's kitchen table in 1987. The same certainty that others called madness. She remembered laying out her own figures on that oilcloth tablecloth, the vise, $8, the fryer tools, $22, coal for the first winter, $14, welding rod, $3.40, total, $84.85. Robert had needed days to think about it. Clara needed seconds. Start tomorrow, Alina said, 3 words flat and final. Clara nodded, already turning toward the door, her notebook tucked under her arm. The audience kept applauding, but Alina watched only her daughter's retreating figure, the military straight posture, the scuffed brown work boots kicking up dust even on Berlin's polished floors. Let me tell you about silence, because you need to understand what isn't said before you can understand permission. Clara hadn't asked. She'd shown. She'd deproven. And Alina had answered with the only language that mattered here, work. The doubters had laughed once, Harlan Briggs at the co-op, the parts counter men, the county extension officer. They'd mistaken unfamiliar for impossible, but Clara hadn't needed to convince anyone. The numbers did the talking. The looms did the work. The proof was in the linen. Later, in the green room, Clara spread her tools on a small table. She laid out Robert's brass calipers beside her tablet, the worn instrument gleaming next to the sleek screen. The calipers had measured every gear, every shaft, every tolerance in the first restoration. Now they sat like an elder statesman beside the digital newcomer. Clara ran her thumb over the engraving on the calipers. Hinge, RV 1947, the year Robert had bought them at a farm auction. She opened the calipers wide, then snapped them shut with a sound like a clock ticking. The same sound Alina had heard 1,000 times in the granary as her father checked her work. Clara placed the calipers gently on the tablet screen, where they overlaid a 3D scan of a loom shuttle, metal meeting light, past meeting future. The calipers cast a thin shadow across the hologram, a bridge between 2 ways of seeing. Let me tell you about hands, because you need to understand how knowledge travels before you can understand legacy. Clara's fingers moved across the tablet, adjusting the scan. She didn't need the calipers to measure anymore, but she kept them close anyway. Alina watched from the doorway, her own notebook hanging at her side. She saw Robert in Clara's focus, the same way she'd seen him in the red shed that first winter, his brass pocket watch ticking in his palm as he studied her cost sheets. The mentor had been right to wait for proof. The doubter had been right to admit he was wrong. And Clara was right to move faster than anyone expected. Let me tell you about speed, because you need to understand how time bends for those who have done the work before you can understand what happens next. Alina stepped into the room. She picked up Robert's calipers, the brass warm from Clara's touch. She measured the width of Clara's tablet screen, exactly 10 inches, just like the Looms' original shuttle race. Clara looked up, smiling. Alina placed the calipers back on the table, the hinge clicking softly. They'd start tomorrow, not with a speech, not with permission, but with work. The same work that had saved them from drought, from debt, from despair. The work that turned scrap into material, rust into revenue, laughter into respect. Alina ran a finger along the spine of Clara's notebook, feeling the dents from years of use already forming. She planted a future in a rusted field. They called it a hobby. The drought came. The corn margins collapsed. The Looms lived. And now Clara would plant something new in the same soil, with different tools but the same eyes. The calipers sat silent between tablet and notebook, a small brass hinge holding 2 generations together. Robert's hands were gone, but his way of seeing lived in every measurement, every calculation, every decision made without asking if it was possible. It just was, because someone had learned to look. Counterclockwise arrows, button rotation, log slot 1, context bridge, 1E slot 2, section transition, 4B slot 3, final reflection, 8G slot 4, opening turn, 9H. On a Tuesday morning in March of 2024, Alina Vance stood in the restored granary behind her Harlan County home, watching her daughter Clara adjust the focus on a laser scanner pointed at the Hawthorne iron loom model T14. The machine hummed with a sound like distant rain, its beam painting precise coordinates onto the cast iron frame that had once been destined for scrap. Clara's wire-rimmed glasses caught the morning light as she squinted at the tablet, her auburn hair pulled back in the same side part her mother favored. How does someone go from dragging engine blocks out of a machine shop pile to standing here, where the past is measured in microns? The answer lived in the weight of the brass pocket watch Alina still carried in her denim jacket, just as her father Robert had. Alina crossed the granary floor, her work boots scuffing sawdust into the old concrete. She stopped beside Clara, who didn't look up. The scanner's blue light traced the loom's tension arm, revealing microscopic stress fractures invisible to the naked eye. Clara's notebook lay open on a crate, pages filled with sketches of gear ratios and digital elevation maps. Alina reached into her pocket and pulled out Robert's brass pocket watch, its chain cool against her palm. She thumbed the latch open. The glass face was still scratched from when he dropped it in the machine shop back in 1983. Inside, the hands had stopped at 10:27 years ago, the day he'd finally said, "You were right." She snapped it shut and slipped it back into her pocket, the weight of familiar comfort. Clara finally looked up, her pale blue eyes mirroring Alina's own. "Mom," she said, "the point cloud accuracy is within 0.005 inches. We can rebuild the entire archive from this." Alina nodded. She remembered the first time Clara had stood in this granary, aged 7, watching her mother clean rust from a gear assembly. Back then, the only numbers that mattered were the ones in Robert's kitchen ledger, the $84.85 that had bought their future. Now the numbers were different, much different. The itemized ledger for 2024 sat on the workbench nearby, 87 restored artifacts, each generating an average of $14,900 in annual revenue. Materials recaptured and remachined. Cast iron, brass fittings, hand-turned maple shuttles. Labor costs held steady at 32%. Total revenue, $1,200,000, 17 employees now. All of it flowed from those 2,800 tons of iron nobody else wanted. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The looms hummed. The ledgers balanced. That didn't last. Not because anything broke, but because the trainees started leaving. Young people like Walter Pritchard's grandson, who'd learned gear calibration in this very granary, now ran their own workshops restoring vintage printing presses in Des Moines. Others had taken the principles further, reclaiming tannery offcuts for luxury leather goods, repurposing warped barn doors into acoustic panels. Each carried the same notebook Alina had once clutched, filled with calculations nobody else believed. They'd all started here, in the red shed Robert had granted permission for, learning that scrap was just material waiting for someone patient enough to see its next life. Clara closed her scanner case. "We're ready to pitch the Berlin Museum Consortium," she said. "They want the digital archives for their new exhibit." Alina nodded again. She remembered Harlan Briggs standing in the same spot during the drought of 1988, his face grim as he handed over the co-op warehouse keys. "I was wrong," he'd said. 3 words that cost him everything he'd ever stood for. Now his grandson worked in Clara's digital team. Most people see rust, and they see decay. Robert Vance saw potential. Alina had learned that lesson kneeling beside him in the machine shop, watching him measure the warp in a discarded piston rod. He'd never called it genius, just good sense. Now she watched Clara pull a chipped mason jar from a shelf, the same kind the bottling plant had paid to landfill back in 1987. Clara held it up to the light, studying the fracture. "We could use these for the exhibit lighting," she said. "The refraction would be perfect." Alina felt the old familiar thrill, not of discovery, but of continuity. The jar had always been useful. People just hadn't known how to look. She remembered the doubters, laughter echoing through the feed store, the way Harlan Briggs's chuckle had sounded like gravel in a tin can. He'd mistaken unfamiliar for impossible. But the iron remembered its purpose. It just needed someone to listen. Alina walked to the far wall where the first restored loom stood under a dust cover. She pulled the cloth away. The cast iron gleamed, every gear polished to a soft sheen. This one had nearly broken her. The tension arm had seized during the first drought test, warping under heat she hadn't accounted for. She sat on this concrete floor at midnight, the smell of hot metal in her nose, realizing cast iron held memory like bone, stress patterns recorded in its grain. The fix had been simple, annealing the arm at 1,200 degrees, then cooling it slow as a winter sunrise. Failure had taught her that, just as Robert's silence at the kitchen table had taught her patience. Just as Harlan Briggs's apology had taught her that even decent men can be wrong. The loom wasn't magic. It was metallurgy. It was knowing when to push and when to wait. Clara joined her, tracing a finger along the loom's shuttle race. The notebook in her hand was the same size as Alina's first one, leather-bound, pages filled with cramped figures. "I've got an idea," Clara said. "Not for restoring, for predicting. Using the scan data to model stress points before they happen, preventing failures instead of fixing them." Alina didn't hesitate. "Do it," she said. The words felt like a full circle closing. 37 years ago, she'd needed Robert's permission to spend $84.85. Now she granted Clara permission to reshape their entire future with a single sentence. Clara's eyes widened, then softened. She snapped her notebook shut. "Thanks, Mom." Alina turned back to the loom. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, catching motes of dust above the silent gears. She thought of Robert standing here with her after the 1988 drought, when the corn had turned to dust but the looms kept turning. He said nothing at first, just run a hand over the clean cast iron, then nodded once. "You were right," he'd finally said, and it had cost him nothing because he'd only ever waited for proof. Now proof surrounded them, not in trophies or plaques, but in the steady hum of machines doing work nobody else thought possible. The drought had come. The corn had failed. The looms had lived, not because of luck, but because they'd been built on ground no banker could call in, no storm could wash away. Clara was already sketching in her notebook, the fountain pen scratching across the page. Alina watched her daughter's hands, strong, capable, familiar in their movements. The same hands that had once struggled with a seized gear assembly now mapped digital futures. But the posture was Robert's, military straight, shoulders squared against doubt. The same posture Alina had carried into Harlan Briggs's office all those years ago, asking for warehouse space while corn prices collapsed outside. She remembered the exact weight of the $84.85 in her pocket that day. The exact sound of Briggs's laugh. The exact moment the numbers on her ledger had tipped from impossible to inevitable. The granary felt full of ghosts and promises. Robert's pocket watch ticked softly in her pocket. Clara's scanner sat ready for its next run. Outside, the Iowa wind moved through fields that no longer grew only corn. Alina adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, the freckles across her nose warmed by the sun. She thought of the cracked engine block she'd dragged from Emmett Vandermeer's scrap pile, how its weight had surprised her at 17. How Robert had taught her to see past the crack to the iron's true grain. Now her daughter saw beyond iron to data points, beyond restoration to prediction. The work never ended, it just changed hands. Elinor walked to the workbench and picked up her original notebook. The leather cover was cracked, the pages stained with oil and sweat. She flipped to the first entry, materials recaptured. Cost, 0. Potential value, unknown. She ran a finger over the words, then closed it gently. Clara looked up from her sketches. Ready for the Berlin call, Elinor nodded. She pocketed Robert's watch one last time. The weight settled against her thigh like an old friend. She planted a future in a rusted field. They called it scrap. The drought came. The corn failed. The looms lived. Counterclockwise arrows button rotation log slot 1 context bridge, 1E slot 2 section transition, 4B slot 3 final reflection, 8G slot 4 opening turn, 9H.